Well, hi everyone, and welcome to our newest online series, Silvain Salon, live from Taos, where we are live from Taos, New Mexico. We're so excited to have you guys join us for this three-part series happening Wednesdays in May, so the 11th, 18th, and 25th. Through this series, we will take a look behind the scenes at our newest production, which is a retelling of André Gretry's Silvain that will be performed in both DC and New York City this June. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to the series host, Opera Lafayette's artistic director, Ryan Brown, to tell us more about this exciting endeavor.
Well, hi everyone. I am here in Taos because we have a residency at the Helene Wurlitz Foundation, and a place I've known since the 1970s actually. And we are here because we are taking this 1770 opera and placing it in the 19th century Southwest. And I thought I would just be in the corner of my screen here, hoping that at some point during our show here, the mountain will appear behind me. And this is Taos Mountain. And there are the relationship between the mountain and just south of us. If you see some smoke, it's because in fact we are 25 miles away. Is the largest fire in America right now, but we don't feel immediately threatened. But it does threaten a livelihood, and the relationship of the mountains to the valleys, to the people who have lived here for hundreds of years, is an extraordinary thing that I don't think we think about in the city very often. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do is elucidate that relationship and how that relationship today in New Mexico actually is related very closely to the relationship which is elucidated in our opera Silvain from 1770. And so to that end, we have these series and two wonderful scholar guests here today. Judith Miller, who is a professor at Emory University in Atlanta and calling in from Atlanta, and Sylvia Rodriguez, who is an emeritus professor at the University of New Mexico and an anthropologist, and who now moved back to her home of Taos, specifically a little village close to Taos, and is very involved in the writing about the acequias, the water system she'll tell us a little bit more about. And I thought that by Judith introducing us to the land issues that are part of Silvain and that were in 1770 in France, and then Sylvia introducing us to the similar issues of common lands in New Mexico, that you would get a sense of why in the world we did this, to set this. So I'm going to just turn it over, introduce you first to Judith, and take it away, Judith.
Thank you very much. And I'm so happy to be here. Any chance that I get to talk about 18th century France, I'm simply delighted. But I will say I'm perfectly capable of messing up things with my PowerPoint. And also, if I start speaking too quickly, just signal that I'm speaking too quickly. But we will start here with the PowerPoint, and I will try sharing. And here we go. And of course, I have it at the very last slide here. I was going through it. So we'll go from the beginning. There we are. So first, conflicts over the commons. I'm really happy to be talking about these issues of the land. And as we go through along today, and especially once we get to Sylvia's presentation, you'll see just how these issues are still right here today, and they are global issues. My own career started with a book on the grain trade in France in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I feel like I'm coming back to my roots, if you will, by talking about problems of land and food and who has access to them. So I want to start with the fact that Emory University, where I am at in Atlanta, was land that belonged to the Creek and Muskogee Indians, the Native Americans, and that this was also the starting point for the Trail of Tears. So we always start with our land acknowledgement. But also we have to think about Emory as a place of enslavement and enslaved people who built the university and all of the connections that we have to enslavement here at my university. Now, the opera. If you are sitting in the opera theater, watching the opening moments of the opera, there is something that would have struck you as very troubling and perhaps illegal. Silvain comes onto the stage dressed as a peasant hunter, and he's carrying a rifle. If you know anything about 18th century French law, unless you are a noble, you should not have access to firearms. You can't wear a sword. You can't wear gold. You should not dress or decorate your home in gold. There are all sorts of privileges that are reserved for the nobility. So here we have Silvain, before he has even uttered a word, showing that he is doing something potentially illegal. And I suspect that probably he is going to be heading off to hunt rabbit. His daughter's getting married. He wants to provide dinner. So I suspect he's heading off to hunt rabbit or pheasants. Now, here's what an 18th century peasant should look like. He has some sort of farm implement. He's carrying what looks like probably turnips. That's an acceptable French peasant. But the guy with the gun is just not, that is not right. So let me start by talking about this issue of what were the common lands. And then I'm going to open things up talking about hunting rights, some other kinds of land conflicts, and then come right to 1770, which is when our opera takes place. And this looks like a very messy map for an estate. This is one that many of us in the field have been using for years and years. You can see it's almost 100 years old, but it's a generic map of the estate. And so here we see we've got common pastures. There's some woodland here. All the way down here, we have the manor house. And in fact, I've got a better image here. Okay, so the woodland, this is land that the community and the Lord would both have rights to. So for instance, the community in theory could go in, gather wood. They can't chop anything down, but they can gather anything that's fallen to use for, say, cooking, or perhaps to build things. But really, the woods are there for the game and for the Lord's hunting. And again, the Lord can hunt with an arrow, bows and arrows. He can hunt with a gun. Peasants should not be in there with guns. Then there's the common pasture. That would be land that the community had access to. For instance, maybe someone has a few horses, some cattle, some sheep. They could take those animals and pasture them there. And then we've got all these different, let's see, we've got wasteland here. This would be something that's too marshy and swampy, but it could be good to pasture some animals on. Then you've got the areas that are planted. The autumn planting would be things like wheat, barley. Spring planting would be oats. And then this land here that lies fallow, because you can't keep farming the land without exhausting this. So this is kind of the basic estate. But where are the kinds of conflicts that would happen here? Well, you see all these little strips of land. In fact, I think let me go back here. All these little strips of land. The yellow-orange ones, that would be land that we planted, and that grain would be reserved for the Lord. Those strips with little diagonal lines to them, those are strips of land that we planted for the church. And everything else would belong, well, not belong, but be rented by different people in the village. So that, say, Ryan, if you're one of the villagers here, you might have a strip of land here, a strip of land over there, and a strip of land over there. You might have 16 or 20 of these scattered all over the place. And then we would farm this as a community. Everybody would know that this is the fallow land. Then there'd be the week when we'd be planting things, and then harvest time would come, and this would all be done communally and collectively. So now it sounds very harmonious. But say, I don't know, maybe Jace has decided that she owns this strip of land, and she'd really like a little bit more land up here, and she'd like to encroach on the common land and just plant a little bit more here into this green common pasture area. Or more likely, the Lord looks things over and says, I'd like to stretch one of my orange strips over. I'll tear out part of the woods or tear out part of the commons. Nobody will notice. The thing is, immediately people notice. And the first thing that happens then is they take people into court. So this village is full of one lawsuit after another, And some of these lawsuits will stretch on for 30, 40, 50 years and go generationally, where they're still trying to get the Lord to admit he was wrong, to have taken that extra 5 acres out of the common pasture. So we've got a very contentious estate here. And in fact, I'm going to kind of proceed by talking about hunting rights, a little bit more on the land, and then come back to our opera in 1770. So hunting rights. This is where Silvain, our hero, has gone astray. He should not have that gun in the forest. Forests are generally reserved for the nobility for hunting. It's very common, for instance, with Louis XVI, it was meticulously noted how many animals of what kind he had killed every day, and he was killing thousands per year. And on a large aristocratic estate where you have hundreds of acres and thousands of animals, that would be one of the main activities during the hunting season. Peasants can't go in there. The villagers cannot go in there and hunt anything. They are forbidden from doing that. Fishing rights, the same thing. The peasants might be able to fish a little bit, but then they've got to turn some of it over to the Lord. And they absolutely cannot cut down trees. However, much of northern France actually looks like this. Where has the forest gone? Well, decades, generations, centuries ago, it was cut down for firewood, for building, homes and other things, and for building navies. And the land still is empty of trees. So you can see, this is the remainder of what happened 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Trees disappeared in many areas of northern France. Now we come to more conflicts, social banditry. And here I've got lots of tales, but we can save those maybe for question and answer later. And of course, the peasants did not agree that they should not have guns. Of course, they believed that they should be able to hunt. In fact, this was even more so in southern France. And I note that Marmontel, who wrote the libretto for Silvain, comes from southern France rather than northern France. So guns in this culture are symbols of masculinity. Does this sound familiar? Of sort of virility, bravado. And of course, peasants went out and hunted. They had to feed their family. Plus, rabbits are annoying. They eat your harvest. Pheasants, other birds are constantly eating the seed that you put down. If they're lucky enough to catch a deer, which is rare, they would have to figure out how to carve it up and drag it home. But deer too, these are all things that destroy your crops. So peasants are always out there hunting. And then the seigneur or the lords are always out there trying to, well, not always, but are trying to catch them. And so if they manage to catch them, usually it's about a 10 livre fine. That would probably feed a family for a couple of weeks. You might spend 10 days in jail. So that's what Silvain is risking, maybe 10 days in jail, and a confiscation of his firearms. So what peasants often did was they would have a couple rusty old broken things. They're easily found if someone comes in with a search warrant. Aha, we found the guns. Yes, we're confiscating them. We're going to destroy them. But the good firearms are very well hidden away. So you've got your decoy firearms and you've got your real firearms. And there are all sorts of conflicts then between those lords and peasants. Again, say the lord has encroached on the land, on the open pasture that's supposed to be there for the peasants and their livestock. So guns are also used to terrorize the lord, take a few pot shots at him. Don't necessarily kill him, but if you can scare him, if you can scare his horse, get the horse to throw him, that's all to the good. So there's this constant tension going back and forth in villages about the guns, about the power of the seigneur, and how are you going to let the seigneur know, let the lord know that he's been out of line and that everybody knows it. Now, sometimes these issues of banditry became even more violent. In the 19th century, a new set of laws was passed by the Bourbon Restoration by Charles X in 1827, and it limited the absolute rights of the peasantry to go into the forest down in Ariège, France, that's down in the Pyrenees. And a war broke out. The peasants dressed up. You can see the War of the Demoiselles, the War of the Maidens. But if you see those people from the book cover, this is Peter Solon's book, the book cover, those do not look like maidens, do they? Instead, it is men dressed up as maidens who have gone into the forest and are claiming it for themselves. And if any of the seigneurial or government authorities tried to come in and kick them out, they were risking their life to do so. The war went on heatedly from 1827 to 1832, but then for the next 30, 40 years until the 1870s, until this war actually died out. So these issues of forest rights are burning issues for communities in the 18th and 19th century. Then we've got these issues of conflicts over land. And I've already told you a little bit about what happens between landlords and the other peasants, the other villagers. But there are very tight regulations about how the land can be used. For instance, if you do have livestock in your village, if you're lucky enough to have maybe a horse, some sheep, maybe a few pigs, you are limited in the number of animals that you are allowed to have go into the common pasture. So every village would have hired a shepherd, someone to handle the pasture and take the village's animals in to that pasture. But if you've been enterprising and managed to get a few more strips of land and a little bit more money and a few more animals, you may well hit the upper limit on what you are allowed to take into the commons. And then you're going to end up in conflicts with your neighbors over that. Then there's the issue of the landlord who keeps looking at all of that pasture land and thinking, I might be able to do something better with that. Perhaps I should turn it over to kick everybody out and have sheep grazing, maybe wool. That's what happened in England. Maybe I should take it over and grow it for wheat for my own use. I will sell that wheat and move everybody else out. So that people are constantly eyeing these common lands, whether it's the forest, whether it's pasture land, whether it's wasteland that could be drained, with an eye to what could I get out of it and what might my neighbor be trying to get out of it. So again, these villages are not harmonious places. They are often filled with all sorts of conflict. And indeed, this is showing you just a little bit more of this, this land. But you can see there's wasteland here that could be taken over if you could drain it, if it's swampy, if you could pull the rocks out, you could do something with it. But then that's less land for pasture. The same thing with this common pasture. If, say, this is the land I was pointing to, if Jace decided she wanted to come in here and grab this, then everybody else is going to be angry with her about that. But that is the constant tension in these villages. And you can see here we have in the 18th century, sort of these open or common fields that everybody is farming together. The whole village says, okay, May 1st, we're going to undertake this activity. July 15th, we're going to start the harvest. And you can see in this other image, the scarring that comes from those individual strips of land. The land is still scarred even now from that plowing. But change is coming. And the change is going to be the enclosures. That landlords especially will increasingly look at the land and get permission through laws to reorganize the land, to make it more rational, to take Ryan's 16 or 17 strips that are all over the place and condense them into one of these strips, into one of these fields, and then to farm it in a way that will be more productive. So that there are new economic calculations going on. And Ryan might be very happy to have all of his 16 or 17 strips put together into one single strip. But there are other people in the village who don't have any land and who are not going to get anything out of this and who are going to be reduced to even greater poverty as this land is being enclosed. But the goal of this new, more productive agricultural system that is being put in place exactly at the time that our opera is taking place is that there will be greater productivity and greater grain, better harvest. Well, there are some laws that are changing right at this point in the 1770s. For instance, there are a group of royal edicts that are being passed that are saying, go ahead and get rid of the common land, divide it up, and a large part of this will come into either the Lord's control for him to rent out, generally under the Lord's control. So that this is happening across France, really over 100, 150 years, but it's accelerating at the time of our opera. And then, as that Lord looks out at the land, he starts thinking about all the other ways that the peasants are essentially taking things away from him. For instance, there had been gleaning rights. After the harvest, this is part of the harvest. The women, mostly children, go out and clean up the extra stalks of wheat. Sometimes they'll have like a whole apron full, a whole pouch of wheat that they're able to gather. They've cleaned the fields. Then animals will come and it'll be fallow and will eat the rest of the stubble. Well, the landlord is increasingly looking at this and saying, actually, that wheat should belong to me. I'll pay people to gather it, but you don't get the extra wheat. You don't get the straw to make baskets or hats out of during the winter that you can sell. That is my property. So another area of tension on the land. Then, and this is a huge issue, but I'll just touch on it. The grain trade had been highly regulated. Who could participate in it? What were the laws that regulated when and how you could sell grain, how far away you could ship it, who could do that? In 1763 to 1770, the government tried to free the grain trade. They'll try again 1774 to 78. They end up with huge spikes in the grain prices as people are searching for profits. I can say more of this if you have questions later. But here's what is happening exactly in our years. You can see roughly about 1763 to 1770 from that slide, what had happened to grain prices during those first years of deregulation. Yes, so that too is shaking up the countryside and shaking up those peasants. And in fact, here's a scene that I have in my book from another moment of freeing the grain trade, and the people of Rouen come tearing into the city and face down the mayor. And it's a very desperate moment. The mayor barely escapes with his life. So I'm wrapping up here, but the question one would ask is how many people sitting, say, in the Opera House at Versailles, and this is the set, as Ryan pointed out yesterday, for what the Opera Lafayette's production in 2012 at Versailles, Le Roi et le Fermier. But how many people who were sitting there in the Opera House would really have understood what was happening out on the land? Maybe half of them. Mostly the aristocracy that is hanging out in Paris or in Versailles was not deeply involved in what was happening on their land. That was more a matter for their estate agents, the other, the people who are handling their land. As long as they have revenue coming in, they were okay. Probably half of them would be following news of grain riots and news of, battles and lords being shot by angry peasants. But the one group of people that really would have understood, had they been allowed to be there in the theater watching the opera, would be all the people who are working the land at Versailles, who had come from the countryside around, from that farmland, from the large forests that surround Paris, Chantilly, Versailles forest. Those people are the ones who would have understood what it meant for Silvain to enter the stage carrying a gun. And for that, Silvain, his rabbits, and I say thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And all sorts of bells are ringing in my head about things that we're experiencing out here to this very day, and which Sylvia can now kind of give us a background to. And there you are, Sylvia. Let's give it first. Maybe we can see you, and then
everybody.
No, you're moving straight. You're moving straight into it. Good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let's see if I can get the. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to begin, of course, as did Judith, with the land acknowledgement statement, which is the statement of Taos Pueblo, which I don't know if you can read it, the whole thing or not, because these pictures are obscuring part of it, but let me read it. It is respectful to recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and the traditional territories. I acknowledge that we are on the historic homeland of the Red Willow people within the original territory of Taos Pueblo. This acknowledgement will oblige as a reminder of our ongoing efforts to respectfully recognize, honor, reconcile, and partner with the Red Willow people whose land and water we benefit from this great valley today. I have to say that growing up in Taos, and I'll show you a photograph, an aerial photograph shortly that actually indicates exactly where I did grow up. The presence of Taos Pueblo is always been central in my mind, and because of the position it occupies, and also because in this arid landscape, which is so different, when I look at Judith's photographs of France, the first thing that stands out is how green it is. And there are overwhelming differences in terms of the aridity and also the sort of historical sequence of conquest and colonization that dominates in the Latin American world, which of course, New Mexico is the far northern frontier of. This is a poster that was produced in the 1960s that also expresses the deep attachment to land, and we have to speak also of water. Here in the Southwest, since everything is really organized around the presence of water from the time before Europeans set foot on this land to this very day. This is, I think, expresses the mestizo, the descendants of the original Spanish colonial settlers who were themselves mestizo and through many generations increasingly products of mestizaje, and their attachment also to the land and also to the water. The term raza does not translate well into English, but it's a term used internally since the nomenclature for people of Mexican American and other Latinx descent is extremely problematic and unagreed on. But raza is a term that I find is used internally acceptably but when you try to translate it into English, it all goes wrong. The overwhelming fact of the Southwest and of the North American borderlands is, of course, aridity. Long before there were farmers and horticulturalists, there were nomadic hunters who also organized around and moved through in relationship to water. The Pueblo people, the ancestral Pueblo people, of course, probably moved from the Four Corners area into the Rio Grande Valley in order to take advantage of stream irrigation to some extent, although they were masters, of course, at dry farming techniques. The other overwhelming historical fact, which I think is evident even today, is what one anthropologist called cycles of conquest. This successive history of colonization, of conquest and colonization, first by Spain, and then by an intermediate period when Mexico gains its independence in 1821, up until 1847, with the Mexican-American War, when the United States incorporates somewhere between half and a third of Mexican territory. And so each of these regimes involves a different enclosure of what you would call the commons as the property belonging to virtually everyone. How pre-Columbian ancestral people conceived of their territory, we don't know. Certainly scholars and anthropologists and archaeologists spend a lot of time trying to figure it out, but the Pueblo people have their own stories about this, and it's not necessarily available to outsiders. But in any case, with the coming of the Spanish, and this is the northern frontier of New Spain in the late colonial period. I don't know if I can, my cursor, here's Taos. They of course traveled up and followed the Rio Grande. Taos was the northernmost. This thing jumps around, so without my control, it seems. I'll have to go, pardon that, is the far northern frontier. The period, I've noticed that the first production of Silvain in New Orleans is 1776. It's just 1 year before the Don Fernando grant was issued, which is the town land grant. There were earlier land grants. Of course, 1680 marks the first colonial settlement is 1598 in the area of what is now Hispaniola. And that's when the first acequias were done, the first irrigation ditches, which were systematically organized in a very different way. It's essentially an Islamic Iberian tradition that was brought to the New World. And one of the interesting things about it, I'll get to later, at least in my interpretation, is how it begins as an instrument of colonization. And Indians certainly dug those first ditches with forced labor, enforced labor. But it changes quite radically under the frontier, the difficult frontier conditions that emerge in the 17th and 18th century. There's a famous revolt in 1680 planned from the Kivas of Taos Pueblo, in which the Spanish are driven out to El Paso. They do 12 years later come back. There's certainly acequias and land grants made before that date. There are no records left of the land grants pre-revolt because all of the documents were destroyed. This is a map of the Spanish and Mexican land grants that were made in New Mexico that are recognized today. Not all of them still exist as legal entities, but this shows the distribution of land grants. You see a concentration in the Taos area. And I have other maps that show how they overlap, but I'm not going to subject you to all of that. I'm trying to cover a giant sweep of very complex history and very bloody history in many ways to sort of give you a sense of the background. This is what happens during the 17th century is that the Spanish colonial settlers, who are really mestizos, began to settle land grants. There are two kinds of land grants, or basically two kinds of land grants that are made by the Spanish crown, usually by the governor or local officials. First were the community land grants made to a certain number of settlers, which had to, of course, have access to water. In some cases, historians believe that the ditches were dug even before the grants were made, because you had to establish how you were going to irrigate. There were many different categories of lands that were used by farmers and ranchers. The Spanish, of course, brought with them, having come through central Mexico, livestock, a whole suite of plants and animals that were not indigenous to the New World. And as they worked their way up the Rio Grande and established these settlements on land grants, mostly on land grants, it completely transformed the ecology and, of course, transformed the indigenous world. There were more than Pueblo people. There were numerous indigenous populations who were settled or moving across the landscape. And with the establishment of property and the state, essentially, all of this was changed. This shows how in the early stages of colonization, there were tended to be smaller grants that were made either to individuals or to communities. And as the 19th century, we move into the 19th century, there are increasing numbers of private land grants made that are bigger and bigger in order to have larger livestock enterprises, basically. And the Spanish incentive originally, of course, in working its way north was really in search of minerals and gold. And when they get to New Mexico, they realize, despite certain myths that have existed, that there isn't really anything. And so the incentive becomes ostensibly to missionize and to Christianize the natives, but also to establish a bulwark against French and American encroachment, which is, of course, spreading across the continent at the same time. So that was largely the incentive. But these large outposts, of course, were very fragile. And after the Pueblo revolt, the Spanish were driven out for 12 years. The horses, so it is said, the Pueblos tried to eradicate almost every trace of Spanish settlement, although they retained certain things. And of course, the horse spreads and is acquired by the Comanches, which transforms the landscape. And some scholars have recently argued that the real empire during this period was not the Spanish Empire, it was the Comanche Empire. And this tended to these nomadic raids and slaving and incredible history of mestizaje and captives and moving back and forth across the groups, and the emergence of genizados, who were detribalized, Hispanicized Indians, is a very complicated history, but it's part of our legacy as a people. This locates Taos, which is, of course, where we're located in that larger landscape. This is Taos from an aerial point of view. If you see that little red circle there, that's exactly where I grew up. Taos Pueblo, of course, is located at the base of Taos Pueblo. It shows the aridity of the landscape, and it also shows where the greenery is. And one of the things that the SAKS did was to extend the greenery. It transformed the landscape and extended the biological life of these ribbons of green along the rivers. We don't know what this landscape looked like before Europeans first got here, but certainly the acequia landscape is the landscape that you see in northern New Mexico. It extended the riparian habitat, increased biodiversity, and also irrigation does definitely recharge the aquifer, so it extends the greenery. I grew up right there on an acequia in the heart of town that no longer exists. I believe, having grown up in Taos, being myself bi-ethnic, was really, although it took me many years to realize why I became an anthropologist, basically to understand what was going on in Taos and why. And I continued to struggle with trying to understand, ever a bit elusive, what is going on and why, and how does this happen in Taos? And I think Taos, in this, as throughout the West, you have this bare bones landscape, which reveals really the bones of the land, and also something that I don't think you have particularly in the East, this notion of a watershed, and a world as being a watershed. If you think of the East Coast, I mean, people don't really think about what watersheds there, and here we're very aware. This is Taos County, and this is the river system. And there's Taos Pueblo, Rio Pueblo. I'm speaking to you from the Rio Hondo up here, where I live in a little valley. But you have these stream systems that originate in the mountains, which are snow-fed, and then run down through the Piedmont into the irrigable valleys. And the acequias were dug off of those. This gives you a sense of what the land uses are in Taos, in the sense of this is the modern period. And what this shows you essentially is that Here on the left, on my right on the green, this is what people would call wilderness. It's debatable whether wilderness is a modern construct or not, but basically it's uninhabitable, although people, of course, now try to inhabit it. Forest, mountain forest. This is the Rio Grande, which bisects the county. On this side is now sageland desert, which is uninhabitable or has been traditionally uninhabitable, although of course people are building houses everywhere where people in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century had more sense than to build houses, and now they do. These light sienna colored areas are the only irrigable and arable lands in the county. This white area in the middle, now just here is the incorporated area of Taos. So what it shows is the irrigated lands are a very small proportion. The actual arable lands in Taos County are a minority of lands. This is a modern map that shows that only 38% of the land in Taos County is privately owned. That means that the rest of it is owned by the state. That is the federal, state, or the state, and that would include lands held in trust by the federal government belonging to the Northern Tiwa people of both Taos and Picarise. I think that the past is present in this landscape in terms of the social geography and the relations that are established really during the colonial period, and I think which are still very visible today. These are the acequias of the Taos Valley. And these are only the main stem acequias, but it shows how extensive they are. And this is really what creates the green belt around in the Taos area, which of course is now being systematically filled in and destroyed by urbanization and the increasing consumption of water. This map, is a colorized version of the acequia landscape. It also gives you the topography. This the 5 streams that make up the basin of Taos in relationship to this larger land distribution. This just quickly shows watersheds, acequias, parishes, and sacred sites. This is from a book that I wrote a number of years ago. All of the settlements on different land grants, and some of them several settlements on one land grant, really consist of several categories of land, including irrigable land, but also land extending into the Piedmont and the mountains, which are of course the common lands, the ejidos, which people use for, livestock herding, grazing, but also for the extraction of all kinds of construction, and all of the materials of life come from that. The settlement pattern was really, classically, although there were both dispersed settlements as well as nucleated settlements, was a placita that was often a defensive one, but not always so neatly enclosed, dedicated to a patron saint. So each of these communities is dedicated and named for a patron saint. And also territories that I think correspond to sort of their resource domains. Their acequias, their meadowlands, their pasture lands, their actual irrigated lands, various categories of lands, and also their sacred sites, which in, of course, the Catholic and tradition include, chapels, graveyards, moradas, which isn't to say that this is sort of, one of the things you have here is these different populations inhabiting this landscape, this arid landscape, casting their own cultural meanings, a net of meanings over the landscape. And it's certainly not the case that this is a pristine landscape when Europeans walked into it. It's a landscape that has been carefully created and husbanded and stewarded and modified by hundreds, perhaps thousands of years of indigenous peoples. And so the landscape that is occupied by the settlers has in many ways already been shaped by indigenous peoples. They retain those who were still occupying the land, and Taos Pueblo was perhaps one of the most iconic and famous of the Pueblo people and of the native North American people because of its history, which you'll hear about from Mr. Suazo in a couple of days. You have sort of layers of different populations coming in and casting their meanings over other, over other layers of meaning. So the Spanish Catholic sacred landscape is already cast over the native sacred landscape. And I would argue that even subsequent populations have in different ways sacralized this landscape in their own terms. This is a drawing that's done by Arnie Valdez, who is Maria Mondragon's partner, in which he identifies, and I don't have time to go into all the different types. This is the landscape, and this is based on the San Luis Valley. But this again shows a watershed, the ditches, and the different kinds of land use and categories that exist within the acequia landscape. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about acequias, which is of course what I focus on in my work today, is that they evolved from a colonizing institution. And over the course of the long 17th and 18th centuries, when the colonizers crept back into the landscape and the area that they had been driven from probably the most successful native revolts in the Americas, stemming from Taos Pueblo. And then there's a sort of receding of state power in some ways, is that these become very gradually, and I think we know almost nothing about these first generations of interaction between the mestizo or the Spanish colonial settlers and the indigenous Pueblo populations. I speculate a lot. Archaeologists, much of it's beyond recovery, is what happened in those first 3 or 4 generations when there was mestizaje, where there was clearly some form of subjugation. There was a great deal of violence, but also a lot of mutual reciprocity and interdependence. At one point, the Spanish colonizers during the 1700s retreat into Taos Pueblo's walls so that they can band together and mutually defend each other against Comanche depredations. Gradually, these small-scale irrigation communities, which really divert water from a stream, for the most part, sometimes from springs, into a mother ditch, off of which there are laterals, and these feed individual properties, become basically a moral economy for managing water as a commons. So I want to speak not only of land as a commons, but of water as a commons. And also this transforms, I mean, the technology, the flora and the fauna brought from the old world transform the Pueblo world and transform Pueblo agriculture. And I think in some ways, dependence on irrigation agriculture begins to replace the vast suite of dry farm techniques of which they were masters. They were familiar, certainly, with diversion, but one archaeologist has talked about how different their traditions of, as far as we know, of irrigating and organizing the land were from what the Spanish brought. These are photographs from the present. And what I talk about here, this is, and when I'm thinking, how do you show managing as a commons? How do you actually represent this? This is an acequia meeting in the community of Valdez. The acequia is organized according to membership in acequias. If you remember, you divert water from an acequia madre, you are known as a parciante. You must contribute labor and dues. You must obey the rules of the ditch, which is basically based on water sharing. One of the important transformations that takes place when the Americans come in is, of course, that many of the land grants are lost through a whole variety of different techniques, back taxes, illicit sale. The Santa Fe Ring becomes a very important sort of informal organization of American and other European entrepreneurs who basically buy up, get huge land grants from Mexico and begin to do a large scale extraction. The Court of Private Land Claims, which adjudicates the land grants that are in existence in the lands that are held at the time of the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, basically, and it's too much to go into, basically, between 70 and 90% of the land held by the settlers is lost. Much of what is now was once the ejido in the common lands is appropriated and becomes federal land. So all of that state land that you see in the land use map was once ejido. And of course, before that, it was the sacred territory of the Pueblo Indians, and how they utilize that and how they conceptualize it, we don't really know. But these are contemporary photographs that show, first of all, I don't know if I'm obscuring all of these. This is the cleaning of the ditch, which is one of the most photographed and famous of the annual rituals, which is every year, Parciantes get together in the spring and clean the ditch, the acequia madre. Individuals are responsible for cleaning their own laterals. And this is a communal labor that's actually a very important time for people, and people joyously, this is just in the last 2 years here in Valdez. This shows when the ditch is clean, they release the water at the head gate, which diverts water off the river, and people stand on the side to sweep out the debris that is still being flushed down. And this is a neighbor on a plot right next to me who's irrigating the land, which is quite a fascinating thing to watch. One of the things that happens with Americanization is not only the appropriation of the common lands from the land grants, but also the imposition of Western water law, which is an extremely important thing to keep in mind, because there are two systems that are really simultaneously operating with acequias. Acequias, and this is true, small scale, farmer managed, farmer organized, gravity driven irrigation systems are found all over the world. Our particular version comes from Iberia, which was occupied by the Moors for 800 years. But there are also indigenous systems that operate in similar ways, probably in central Mexico and certainly in the Andes. They're all on almost every continent, and they have very similar organizational principles. One anthropologist is called moral economy. And basically here, what it means is that when the water is scarce, you share it. People share the scarcity. Western water law comes in, which is really a whole transformation of the concept of water, so one is called modern water, which is the abstraction of water, and the imposition of a different law, which is first in time, first in right, based on mining claims. So you have Western water law, you have the state of New Mexico imposing Western water law, but also incorporating it as subdivisions of the state, the acequia systems. So they're philosophically and operationally extremely different systems. One is based on sharing, the other is based on the zero-sum game. One scholar has argued, again, earlier revisionist scholars of the land grants argued that part of what was going on with the Americanization was two very different legal systems. More recently, a historian has argued that really, basically, that property is theft, and that it's an inherent difference. Once you have a sovereign, property is separated and is enclosed and appropriated through acts of violence. And of course, we have this history of violence, but also that development is now a later iteration of the same way of appropriating resources. Notice they're leaving the Arroyo Hondo land grant. After the land grant movement of the 1970s, some land grants began to, it sort of revised how people were thinking about the causes of poverty and the exportation of labor in the 19th century and the 20th century, having to do with the massive loss of lands and the curtailment of agricultural activity, which of course decreases after World War II. But with the land grant movement, there was a greater awareness of the history, and it was became very politically activated. People began to put signs, and you'll see in Taos, signs entering or leaving the La Serna land grant, which is a big land grant southeast of Taos, and the Arroyo Hondo land grant. And it's a reminder that what you see going up towards Taos Ski Valley was once a ejido, and of course now is National Forest, named for Kit Carson, who was one of the trappers who came in and was part of the American Order.
I think that might be a moment to say that, in fact, there are also signs as I drive down here of tierra o muerte, land or
Right.
death, which of course stems from that.
And that stems from the land grant movement.
Given our
Yes.
time right now, I think maybe we should allow for a few questions. let me thank you, both Sylvia and Judith. I want to tell everybody that Sylvia and Judith have graciously said that they'd stay on past the hour, so that any of you who want to stay on, please do. They'll be available for questions. And I thought I'd just quickly give you a sense that where we're going in the next 2 weeks. In a week, we'll have our director, Tanya Hernandez Velasco, talk about her relationship and her family's relationship with land and the loss of land, along with Maria Mondragon Valdez, who will speak specifically to the situation in San Luis, and one historical situation which has inspired our setting here in New Mexico of this opera, and then actually how the French got involved, which is fascinating in ways that Sylvia alluded to, or she alluded to who's coming in and getting these land grants. Well, they were a lot of entrepreneurial robber baron type Frenchmen. And we'll learn about that next week, as well as get a personal take from our director. 2 weeks from now, we'll meet with our costume director, Patricia Michaels, who is from the Taos Pueblo, and a Taos Pueblo elder, Gilbert Suazo, who was there in part of the reclamation of Blue Lake, that land which is sacred to the Pueblo behind me, which was taken away from them in 1906 and was restored to them by an act of Congress and signed by Richard Nixon in 1970. So there's a couple of new stories to tell, and some specific ones that we'll tell after having been given this wonderful background by both Judith and Sylvia. So that's where we're going in the next few weeks. But I'd like to, who has questions, you can either unmute yourself or ask a question in the chat, whichever you're more comfortable with. And we're glad to, our scholars will, I know, be glad to go farther. Somebody want to try? Go for a question? Hi, Lynn. Do we have one in the, there's too much to talk about. Is anybody who wants to take a stab? Well, I'll mention, if please go ahead and interrupt me if you have a question. Yeah.
So
hi, Susan.
Hello. This is fascinating, and I'm sure you're only skimming the very top of your knowledge base and reducing this to us for this short format. But I'm curious, Ryan, based on the information we're getting now and we'll get from the future speakers, are you, in our presentation of the opera, are we transforming the roles into versions of the people that we've had described here tonight? That is, we're not going to be presented with French noblemen, but we're going to be presented with some version of the kind of characters that played in the history that Judith and Sylvia
That's correct.
described.
That's correct. We are taking, there are, as we'll learn next week, a role for very wealthy French, or people who became wealthy by getting these land grants from the Mexican government in the 1820s and 1840s, and then settling San Luis in the 1850s and early 60s. So there will be roles there will be French characters and there will be then Hispanic characters and this cross of indigenous and Hispanic characters within our cast of 11 or 10 or 11. One of who's been with us here. And so, in fact, and while we'll be singing the arias in French, the dialogue will be in English with a smattering of French and Spanish to suggest the origins of the characters in the opera, in our setting of it. And Lynn Carey Mato, who's here with us, helped us with that process of transforming. Actually, the libretto, we were pretty ginger with it. It's pretty close to what exactly it was. Other questions? Judith, you have a comment or a question?
No, question for Sylvia. I'm absolutely, as Ryan knows, I've taken up skiing in the last few years, and of course, am obsessed with it. But the end of your talk had that Taos, and I know something of the issues around snowmaking. But I was just wondering if you could fill that out. What are the conflicts that are going on right now around the Taos resort and water?
The Rio Hondo watershed originates in the Wheeler Peak wilderness.
Which is New Mexico's tallest mountain at 13,000 feet.
Which is the tallest mountain in New Mexico. The other streams that I briefly showed are all tributaries of Rio Pueblo, which is itself a tributary of the Rio Grande. The Rio Hondo is a tributary of the Rio Grande. It originates high in the mountains, and it runs about 20 miles through the Arroyo Hondo watershed, which is the location of the Arroyo Hondo land grant that was made in the early 19th century. Probably it was settled a little bit before that. There are 2 land grant communities in that watershed, in the valley itself, and then an upland community that diverts water also in a ditch that appears to run uphill. So the community of Valdez or San Antonio and Arroyo Hondo, whose patron saint is Our Lady of Sorrows, are downstream. So the lake and the river itself is fed by the lake and also by springs in the high mountains that run underground for several miles and then emerge into springs at the headwaters of what's called Twining Canyon, which was a favorite of the Taos artists. And before that, the site of, there was a lot of, after the Civil War, considerable amount of mining that was done in the Rio Hondo watershed. That boomed and busted, boomed late in the 19th century, busts in early 20th century. One archaeologist thinks it was the actual first industrial footprint in northern New Mexico. In the community, in the Valdez Valley, there was a large trading mill that produced whiskey and also had, people say it was like Walmart. It had a lot of goods, accumulation of goods that came across the Santa Fe Trail. That was sacked and burned in the 1847 revolt against the American occupation, where the first American governor was murdered and scalped. They then moved to Turley Mill and burned and sacked that. So this watershed has had a history of industrial plundering. In the 1957, a small ski resort was established up there and grew and grew and grew. And during the 1960s and 70s, it began to pollute the Rio Hondo, which is used not only for irrigation, but for livestock and also for domestic purposes of these small villages downstream. There was protest against that. A sanitation plant was established and that cleaned up the river somewhat. But one of the fears has always been that the resort would grow and grow and grow. In 2014, it was purchased by a hedge fund billionaire who has initiated a program of a massive expansion, reconfiguring the river and the landscape. And this is causing quite a lot of concern by the downstream communities, not only in terms of water quality as this continues to grow, and of course, snowmaking is one of the activities that they use water from the river for, but also whether in fact those springs will be which are the source of the Rio Hondo, will be exhausted by the scale of development that's taking place. There's also secondary development, raising of the tax base, gentrification, conversion of, by the transfer of water. One of the things about the abstraction of water under the American system is that was inconceivable before, was that you can separate water from the land and sell it as a commodity and transfer its use to another location, which is what has happened to some extent at the Ski Valley. They've bought irrigated water rights off of irrigated land and transferred those rights to their own uses, their own commercial and domestic uses and snowmaking uses upstream, which leaves the agricultural land forever fallow. All of the water in New Mexico is already over appropriated, which means if you want to get more water, you have to take it from another source. The water rights owned by the acequias are the oldest and most precious water rights in a system where priority is everything. So it sets up a water market. So it's water quality, water quantity, and massive development, building of large-scale hotels, digging of new roads, new ski lifts, all on national forest land. The Kit Carson National Forest is the landlord to the ski industry. So that's basically the conflict that it continues in some ways. And there's much more to be said about that because a lot of local people ski as well. And skiing is a very popular sport. It's also, as you probably realize, on line for extinction, given climate change.
Yeah, as they say, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting.
Right. It's also for sharing and reciprocity and mutual dependence, and for managing water as a commons.
Well, that of course is the moral lesson in this, and what we might be able to learn from the past. Well, your pictures of cleaning the ditches, that's what I was doing 2 weeks ago.
Right.
Although in a different system, in the first rate system in Colorado. Other questions? We have with us, I see Zach Powell is here. Zach is going to come out next week, and he is the unsympathetic character. As sympathetic as you look right there, Zach will play the unsympathetic brother who forbids the lead character to use the land that he's been used to using and being able to use. Put on your snidely whiplash mustache. But and in fact, he's the only, oddly, interestingly enough too, his is the only role which is not sung. It's only an acting role. And I'm not sure if that has something to do with your the lack of sympathy that we have for your character, but maybe. Other thoughts? Carrie, Kathy, Jean, Adrian, Mike. I'll mention that one of the lines I said, one of the things I learned from Maria this morning was that up in San Luis, suddenly an issue which has been ignored for a long time as a local land use policy is going to be enforced because the elk are coming down from the mountain because there's no feed left and eating the hay that the farmers have in the lowlands. And one of the lines we actually took out in our reduction of the libretto of the opera was, and we need the right to protect ourselves from the wild animals from eating our crops. So these issues are ongoing from 1770 to 2022, as we'll hear more about next week when Maria tells us about the situation of the people of San Luis and the La Sierra, or the land which was traditionally used by them, but has been in private hands, and various private owners have tried to exclude the traditional uses from those lands. Anybody else have something they'd like to add before I thank our scholars for being with us today? And you will have another chance when you come. I hope you'll all be able to see the performance June 2nd and 3rd in the Kennedy Center, and June 7th in New York at the Museo del Barrio. We'll have both Sylvia and Judith with us in person. And so any question we missed today, we can have another chance.
It was nice seeing you all.
Good. Well, our costumes will be, as I said, we'll get to hear from Patricia Michaels in 2 weeks about about the costumes. They're quite extraordinary. And as we add our layers of that you do in creating an opera, we'll finally also you'll learn a little bit about the images that we'll do for projection design next week when Tanya Hernandez Velasco speaks with us too. So it's a full project, and we're just at the beginning, even if it seems like we're in the 11th hour. So thank you all again, and I hope we'll see you next week.
Thank you for this stunning juxtaposition that you've put together, Ryan.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. I don't think it wasn't obvious right at the beginning, but it seems to become obvious, at least to me, as we talk more and more about it. So, all right. Well, best to everybody, and we'll see you next week, I hope.